had me at Cello, Cello. You had me at Cello. You had me at Cello. Oh, you had me at Cello. Hi, everybody. Look at the time, 5 o'clock on a Friday. Welcome to another episode of Cello Chat. Now, about once a year, I do something outside the box and interview somebody who is not a cellist. And it's always, very interesting. And of course, there's always a reason for it. Today's guest, Stacey Krim, does not play cello, but has exposure to an inordinate amount of cello repertoire every day as part of her job. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Stacey, how are you doing?
I'm fine. How are you?
I'm doing very well and very excited about this. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Well, first of all, I want to say you have also um, consented to interview with the cello library folks who,
Hmm.
and that interview is great too. And we've had cello library people on this show as well. But I have some different things that I want to ask you about. But I definitely want to refer people to that interview too. But before I get started with questions about this very interesting and unique collection, what is your background? What path got you to be not only a librarian, but the librarian of this collection?
So some of that is random chance.
Ah.
Some would say I won the lottery of jobs, at least from a cellist perspective. So my first master's was in anthropology, which I absolutely adored because it covered so many topics. It's such a holistic discipline, and that's really served me well. But my entire time in school, in at university, both undergraduate and graduate, I was working in libraries in some form or another, public libraries, academic libraries, special libraries. And I realized that it was that aspect of research and helping people with their research was really what appealed to me. So I came to the University of North Carolina at Greensboro to get my master's in library and information sciences. So to be a librarian in the United States, you have to have a American Library Association accredited degree. And this institution had it. And most academic people going into academic libraries are going to have usually two masters or a PhD in addition to their MLIS. So I knew that was the route I was going to go into. Also, what happened to be at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro was the cello music collection. And I graduated with my MLIS around 2008 when the economy was tanking. And I already had a full-time job, but I was in another department doing something entirely different. And I was randomly, just to reposition personnel, moved to special collections. And my new department head comes to me one day and says, "Hey, Stacey, would you like to take over the cello music collection?" Which was the most bizarre thing. And I was really scared. And I was scared. I still, I do my best to do right by the collection. I have done that since then. But I was working with a really wonderful our cello music cataloger at the time, Mac, who had been here a few years before I started, and there had been no position working exclusively with the cello music collection in our special collections unit where it's housed. So I gave the caveat that I am willing to try, but I don't, if I end up thinking I cannot handle music because I respected music as a discipline and you cannot just jump into it easily, I would back out. And it turned out that I survived. So I did have enough of a music background informally to be able to read music at a basic level. I've never been a musician, and that's probably for the best. That's what I've learned is sometimes you just have to give up. So if you just don't have the ability, maybe it's best to give it up. But I began in 2010 working exclusively with the collection, the cello music collection, and I started by reinventorying the entire collection that we had at that time. So my, I guess I could say my education in cello music literature really came from Luigi Silva, because his collection was the foundation collection in the UNCG Cello Music Collection. And Luigi Silva's library is a very good place to start. I don't know how familiar you are with Luigi Silva. I feel like more people are picking up on his work, but his library was renowned, and he was such a impressive pedagogue and performer of his time, that I don't know, a few hundred scores into his collection. And I was like, oh, I get it. And why am I dealing with this collection? Isn't it someone better? And that's when I vowed to live up to the cello music collection. So I've had to learn the entire way, but in some ways that's very good for an archive, because um, unlike a music librarian, an archivist is very limited in scope to their collections. So the collection is my world, where a music librarian has to be able to answer questions about a little bit of everything on any topic in music. They have to be very generalized with research. And so learning from the collection here, I could not help but develop a really wonderful and broad understanding of the cello music world, especially more historically, because of the collection being more historic in nature. But I really got a very good understanding of the collection, with the contents of the collection, the types of musicians the cellist in our collection are, and the types of people they were as well. Because when you spend most of your living hours worrying about the collections of these musicians and their legacy, you treat them like family. They become your family.
Nice, nice. Now let's see. So Silva's was the first, but now there are, what is the number? Is it 12 or 14? How
I
many?
think we're at 26 now.
Wow.
So
I'm
would you
way
like me to
behind
go
the
through them?
times. Yeah.
So Silva's library came here in 1963, and it came here because of Elizabeth Cowling. So Elizabeth Cowling was a faculty member here. She was hired back when we were a women's college in 1945, and she was a cellist, and she wrote the cello, which I always keep by my desk. So this was
It's a good.
wonderful resource for people. And she really made her name as a historian of the cello. And she was a colleague of Luigi Silva. And when he died in 61, she collaborated with the Friends of the Libraries here to purchase his collection. And it was the only collection that has ever been purchased. All of the other collections have been donated. So 63 was kind of the foundation. And the reason that we have this huge collection in Greensboro is because Elizabeth Cowling, in her research for her book, went to all the archives in Europe and across the big cities of the United States, and realized there was no centralized location for cello music research, and decided that she would have it at her school. So we got there early enough in the popularity of the cello in the 20th century, really, to begin growing, though there are many wonderful collections at other institutions. So Cowling's collection came after Silva's, and then Rudolf Mott's, and Maurice Eisenberg, and Janusz Scholz, and Fritz Mogg. And then the more modern additions have been Bernard Greenhouse, Laszlo Varga, Lev Aronson, Lubomir Georgiev, Marion Davies, Ennio Bolanini, Douglas B. Moore, Margaret Rowell, Nicholas Anderson, and Jonas Starker, and Lynn Harrell, and Martha Gershevsky, and Janet Horvath. So I'm happy to get some more women represented. And I still have a few, around 3 or 4 collections that are unprocessed, which would be the later collections. So I'm making my way through those.
And never ending as it continues to expand, because every year you have additional people offering to donate yet more materials.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I think a difference between this archive and other archives is it's not just that it's someone's donating a great music collection, it's that they're going to the home of cellists here. Your collection will be among your peers.
Right.
And I view myself as very having a great responsibility to the cellist community, who's the primary users of the collection. So it is we have other music collections, but those are the primary collections we are concerned about. So you're always a star when you're coming into our collection if you're a cellist.
Yeah. Well, I have to say, when I got to go, I just loved it. I just loved spending, what was I there for, 6 days, just pouring over. I think at one point you showed me the aisles
Mhm.
of boxes. I don't know, kind of what came to mind was the scene at the end of the Indiana Jones, where it just, wow, all of these boxes are full of treasures. But among the many things that I love about the collection is, I mean, I think without having tried to do this at all, among the people that you have there who you just listed, you have Russian, German, British, French, Spanish, what former Yugoslavia, Hungarian, it's
Mhm.
Italian. It's very interesting not only to see, of course, different people's approaches and to think, okay, whom did they study with, and what size hand did they have, and all these other things, but there's also a story being told in terms of just the national traditions at a particular time. I think the whole collection is just makes for a fascinating summary of certain aspects of cello playing from, over a century.
Mhm. Yeah, our collection is representative really of people escaping Europe during World War II. That was the foundation of our collection, and it is the foundation of a lot of arts and sciences in the United States that we now claim. We had this incredible transmission of cultural and intellectual wealth coming in from other countries and conflict and making their homes here and thriving. The only person who did not immigrate to the United States was Rudolf Motz, and it was because he felt he was too old, though he did travel to the United States. But there was a lot of concern about when he died, of course, it was still a very unstable state in Croatia, and there was concern about would his collection be sold off in pieces or taken into someone's private collection. And one of his students basically smuggled the collection out of Croatia into Canada and drove it to Greensboro, so that way it could be kept intact and safe and made accessible to the public. So there's throughout the collection, there are so many stories like like that, these amazing stories that of the lives of the musicians and their music. It's just when I take people on tours of the collection, I can never get through all of those stories.
Yeah, right. In fact, you're probably learning additional ones even each year as well.
Mhm.
So as far as what people would see by going and looking through these collections, I know, speaking for my own research, I could not have done my book on fingerings. I feel like a central component to them was being able to speak from having looked at many schools of thought beyond the ones of my own teachers. And then also, I put together a couple of surveys that I had sent out before publishing the book. And those were based on some aspects of fingering choices that I saw when I went there. So just pouring over different people's approaches. Then there's also the marginalia, the notes that they'll make to pieces that they used as teaching pieces, or even notes to themselves. And then in the cases of, we've mentioned Motts and Mogg, there are a lot of teaching materials, some of which are just not available, they're not published. And then there's even things like their own cadenzas to concertos. At least those from my time there were the takeaways of some of the real reasons to go and pore over this oneself. But I'm probably leaving stuff out. What are some of the other things in the collection?
So there are several layers that someone can explore in the collection. And you could begin with manuscript material. So original compositions or original arrangements by the cellists in our collection, which of course Rudolf Motz was a major composer in that area, and Luigi Silva had so many transliteration or so many arrangements in his collection. So you have this creative layer of transposing and creativity. Then we look for the performance notes of the cellists. One of the reasons we are collecting archival collections of cellists as opposed to purchasing individual pieces is it's the relevance to that cellist that makes the piece important. It's not that it's necessarily a unique published version, although that is very nice to have. It's that this piece was performed by Bernard Greenhouse, or that this piece was performed by Fritz Mogg, and you get to see all of the annotations, and you get to see sometimes, depending on the individual changes in the annotations, two different editions of the same piece, but with different annotations. An annotation for 5-string cello in addition to what you're seeing. So there are so many variations in performance. And probably if I would consider the greatest treasure of the collection would be those performance notes, because as technology is at the present, I feel like performance notes are still the best way to historically document a performance from the performer's point of view. You have audio, but audio quality necessarily was not very good in the past, or there may be questions of the equipment that you're listening to it on. In fact, that's why Luigi Silva didn't record that much. He didn't like the sound of his instrument when it was recorded. Video is nice, but usually videographers are not focusing on trying to capture the musician performing and every movement being performed. They're focused on making things look interesting. So they're going to look at someone raising their eyebrow in the middle of a particular note or flash across the crowd. So the performance notes are where you can get a record of every movement potentially with bow or finger that the cellist is doing, in addition to other little notes. And while it may not represent a static performance, because you never know how much a musician is going to make tiny changes in the course of their performance, it does give you the best idea of how each performer interpreted the piece overall, and would, on average, perform the piece, let's say. So the performance notes, we get requests from those from recording artists down to amateurs. So there are a lot of people who view this who just want to see the differences. So you can do comparative analysis and pick a piece that has performance notes across the collection, like Shlomo, and see how each individual cellist performed it, which is very commonly done. I'll usually be asked, can you pull three well annotated pieces for me? And we also have students who are looking for kind of the teacher's guide to playing a piece, because if you can have the notes of a great cellist, well, maybe you want to use them if they have an easier way of doing something. So I get that quite a bit too, and it's wonderful that there's that dimension. So, the personalization, then you get to see what pieces ended up in someone's collection. So how many Johann Sebastian Bach suites ended up in a person's collection, but which ones did they actually use? And then you get down to the varieties of editions and special publications. The search of analyzing between different editions of the same piece is very popular among researchers, and there can be quite a bit of variation that we did not know existed until you really have the opportunity to be in a place that has several editions that you can look at side by side. So there's also people who are looking for music in the public domain to perform where they don't have to worry about copyright issues or engrave themselves and do a performance version. So there's a variety of ways that the collection is used.
Excellent. Well, and there are variables in there, for example, that make it more difficult, like the fact that not only, I was about to say there are different approaches to notating fingerings, for example, just to stay with fingerings, but I almost want to go so far as to say I don't think any two of them necessarily consistently use the same system as somebody else. So sometimes there'd be a dash in there, and now what does that mean, or a slash or something like that. So okay, now you want to look through one person's collection more and try to figure out, does this for sure mean this? And now what was that? Does that basically then mean the same thing as what this other person was meaning, but with a different marking? But I definitely, some of the pieces that to me came across as, even though it was in one person's collection, it was their teaching copy, because they were making lots of very specific notations all the time that, I mean, I just highly doubt that they needed when they played on stage. It looked more like they're putting a bunch of tenutos at the top of this phrase to really draw a student's attention to, oh yeah, this is, really bring all this out and such. I mean, it's amazing. It's kind of intimidating a little bit to think of just how much there is that one could explore. You could just take one very specific thesis and spend hours and hours and hours pouring through the collection, comparing and learning from all the different approaches. Sorry, one of the other things, kind of to what you mentioned before, with not only what people have in their collection, but then what they chose to mark on, because some of the pieces didn't have a whole lot of markings in them, and others were very heavily marked up. But just, there's even studying, one of the things that I looked at and asked you to pull more for me were some of the pieces that have a history of, kind of like when they were first written, having been declared practically unplayable. And here are these people who are playing them and performing them, So it's like, okay, how did everybody kind of has to go outside the box of standard, this is how you play the cello, in order to execute some of these things. Just what markings did they do to reveal how they did that? Anyway, it is truly a wonderful collection.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so definitely I do a lot of teaching, and one of the things I teach is how to do research in an archive. So when I'm working with music classes, usually music graduate classes, I have a little exercise for them to try to figure out, is this, did someone perform this piece, or was it a teaching piece? And we may not know for certain what it was, or was this just maybe marked down for a little bit for someone's own edition that they were creating. So what I always do is tell them to look at the score like an artifact. So take your eyes away from the music for a minute and look at how beat up this piece, the score is. It's usually going to be missing, the performance scores are usually going to be missing their cover because they've been shoved in either the case or they're someone's bag. You're going to see a lot more page turn damage usually on a performance piece than a teaching piece. Some musicians will mark a lot, but usually it's in between. Going to be a lesser amount for someone's performance piece, or it's going to be very messy where you can tell they made changes while the music was sitting on a stand at a diagonal angle with the pencil. So there's all sorts of mysteries, and they can continue back to like the 1700s. We have a compilation of pieces that are handwritten, and on the cover, there's drops of wax. So you can imagine a cellist trying to play these by candlelight, you know. So there's just, little things you can look at. You'll see coffee stains, tea stains, cigarette burns, wine stains. If you see a lot of tape, that's usually a sign it was a performance piece. So you'll see people make little handles for pages. So the way each piece is personalized gives a lot of insight to what the musician was performing and how when they encountered the pieces that were going to be a little bit more difficult, especially the rough page turns.
Interesting. So who are some of the other, or if it's not names, maybe what are some of the other projects that you have assisted with when cellists have come to learn from the collection?
Sure. So we have cellists who have recorded pieces that are from our collection. For example, Zul Bailey recorded the Varga octet version of Don Quixote that's in the collection. And that's unique, and it's wonderful in that you don't have to get an orchestra to play the piece. You can get eight performers. So we do get, sometimes it's a bit thrilling to see a thank you in someone's CD. We have researchers who are writing books or have written books where we'll get a thank you from them at some point in the book. I always like to help people who are doing teaching with students, helping them get material that is age appropriate and skill level appropriate for the students. And I think my favorite interactions are when students of the cellist in our collection contact me and they will say something along the lines of, I studied this piece with my teacher, but I wasn't in a good frame of mind at that time to really learn it. Do you have the annotations for this? And that's a bit like keeping their teacher alive through their sheet music. Or I'll have someone who's from an entirely different country and never stepped foot where a particular cellist taught, and they discover a cellist in the collection that they just really love their annotations and their work. And it's almost like that cellist becomes their teacher after death. So they'll go from asking, I would like any annotations you have on this piece to, I want to know what Fritz Mogg would say about this piece, and that's just a wonderful way of being a part of keeping music and the legacy of these musicians alive and thriving in the world. And I'm very honored to be a part of that.
All right. Well, the agreement, when I came, this was, what was it? It was over a decade ago, but it was that I could take all the photos I wanted of the various pages and share them with the cellists in my studio, but just give credit, just always, acknowledge that they came from this special collection at University of North Carolina, Greensboro, which I think is, I almost had to pinch myself. That just seemed I'm used to either, if there's not a charge, there's usually at least more red tape than that. So one of the things I wanted to thank you all for was that willingness to help this information get out there. And ever since then, every year, students, okay, I'm working on this piece, and they access, okay, when I went, I got 8 different cellists fingerings of that particular passage, and it's a wonderful starting point. Of course, we'd all love to take the field trip to Greensboro, but barring that, I thank you very much for allowing us to benefit that much from all of this information.
Absolutely. So accessibility is important to us, and we don't want to make research more difficult than it already is. And no one's getting rich in this business for the most part. So it just seems antithetical to charge, first of all. And there are copyright issues, but for the most part, as long as we're looking at annotations or original manuscripts, we're usually going to be fine with that as long as it's not going to be published and widely distributed. So we have a scanner in our reading room that people can bring a memory stick now and just plug that in and scan and make the copies, because I know, what's the point of only having 3 pages of annotation from a concerto? You need the whole piece for it to make sense. So for the most part, we don't charge, only usually if it's like an external, if someone wants something we can't reproduce in-house, that's the only time we charge. The only limitation is basically the labor, because I'm a one-woman show, so I usually limit it to around 50 pages per request.
Got it. All right. So I'm just kind of curious, you're, as an anthropologist as well, how has curating this collection, I mean, not being an anthropologist, I'm just wondering if you find the comparison of these different people's lives and personalities as revealed through this very important material to them interesting.
Absolutely. And I kind of, when I started, looked to leveraging the strengths I have, which was not music at the time. And that is one of the things that I did leverage. So we have a very international collection. There's many languages that are represented. I can't necessarily read all of them, but I can read portions of them, and I generally know the music vocabulary well enough. The preservation of the material and the handling of the material to make it live longer, but also be accessible, definitely can fall within the realm of anthropology in terms of archaeology and museum studies. We are dealing with a variety of paper depending on the time period and when the piece was made, produced, where it was produced. So there's a strong preservation chemistry element to it, to how acidic the paper is, and the type of material that was used. And one thing I have learned in my time as an archivist is all archives are just collections of people being people in some way. So you have to understand the circumstances of their history and where they are coming from, to understand what you are seeing in the collections. And when I'm processing collections and trying to put them in an order, these are all elements I need to keep in mind, basically to make them, to retain an order, that the original order that may have existed, that the performer put in their collection, which may be their sheet music, their personal papers, their artifacts, textiles. We can get just about anything in. But try to represent that to the researcher once it is fully processed, so that a researcher would be able to understand, have basically the biography of that individual's life spread out for them in the collection. So I always compare an archival collection to a biography, where every item in the collection is like a page in that biography. It's always fascinating because you never know what you're going to find in a collection, and every piece reveals something about this person that you sometimes, and it's a mystery a lot of times, excuse me. So there are still pieces and collections that I don't know why they are there. Like Ennio Bolognini has a bayonet that was produced in Germany in the late 1800s in his collection. I have no idea why that exists in his collection. He was born in the 1890s. I have found cat toys. Um, I have found like a little, those paper hats that kids would get at diners and restaurants. There was one that was signed with a bunch of people's names in Bernard Greenhouse's collection. Um, Luigi Silva liked to write a lot on napkins. So there's all sorts of notes on napkins throughout the collection, in his collection, that are, sometimes it'll be like little cadenzas and sometimes it'll be a teaching note. So I've seen, a menu, like a list of Chinese food I think someone was ordering from takeout. So you have this interesting insight into the daily lives of people. And if you're lucky, you also get journals or diaries, and those may just be date or they may have more information. You're sitting and reading through people's email or mail correspondence, both personal and professional. So you see relationships develop, you see relationships fall apart, you see scandals. It's you become very close to that person and understanding their motivations through the collections. And I think anthropology has really helped me to be a better observer, even though I'm doing it not directly, but indirectly through the collections as opposed to observing people.
Boy, I can only imagine the challenge of deciding how to catalog certain things, how to organize it.
Yeah, there's always a miscellaneous folder, and you try not to make it too big because you want everything to have a phone home, but there's always things you just have no clue why this is in the collection, that you end up putting, or you end up changing your ordering entirely to make a home for something that is so out of place so it can have a place. And that's just it's part of the job. Every collection is like reinventing the wheel to some extent.
Interesting.
And I love the sheet music because I like to look at the sheet music and the annotations before I actually do much research on the person's life, because I like to form an opinion and then go back and see if I was correct. So I play a little game
Nice.
about that. It's just a really interesting experience to be able to have the raw material in front of you and find an order to that. That makes sense.
Very nice. So, projects coming up for the remainder of 2024.
Sure. So we are having a library renovation, which means we are preparing for that. I do anticipate I'm doing my best to make certain the cello music collection will be still accessible in some way, though I don't know if that will be only digital, or if it will be in part person or digital, because I'm not 100% certain where I'm going to end up yet. So be on the lookout for updates about that may be involving accessibility. I am presently trying to finish up work on processing Janusz Starker's personal papers. So I'm hoping to have a finding aid online so people can browse through that. There's a lot of manuscript material relating to his cello treatise, but also a lot of diaries and journals that really give you great insight into what was going on in his mind at certain times, that were things that were cello related and things that were not cello related. And I think people will find that very interesting. I will also be processing probably the next collection will be Martha Gershevsky's collection. So that will greatly enhance the number of cello ensemble pieces in the collection, because she works so much with the University of Georgia cello ensemble there. So we're going to go into more of a processing phase of getting material in order and online, less of a celebration phase, because we simply won't have access to space as much at that time. If you have any concerns about visiting the collection, people are welcome to contact me.
Terrific. Well, thanks so much for your time. I think this is a remarkable resource, and highly recommend. Any of you watching, highly recommend. It's well worth the trip. And again, it's not just the collection, but you all are so helpful as well, which is very, very much appreciated. So thank you, Stacey.
Thank you. Thank you. And I hope people will reach out to me and visit.
Great. Well, in the meantime, everybody, happy practicing all week. We'll meet back here next Friday. And if you happen to just discover some additional annotations in your music or what have you, and it sparks an interest that is another fun rabbit hole to go down, so much the better. Take care.
You had me at Cello.